We're going to discuss bottling table wines today. And in this operation, we want to use the conditions, the operating conditions, bottles, closures that will permit only the desirable changes in wine and prevent the undesirable ones from acting. So what we must consider are methods of preventing yeast and bacterial growth, especially in wines containing some residual sugar. Consider the type of filler it's going to be used, the bottle, the closure, and of course the bottling procedure. Now we have a number of methods of preventing yeast growth. They're listed there in your mimeograph. I'm going to discuss each one in turn and in some detail. Pasteurization, of course, is one of the oldest methods that have been used for securing sterility in bottled wines. And it's a work done a number of years ago by Dr. Castor, a former member of my department, where he found that the length of time required at different temperatures was 150 degrees, 40 seconds, 175 degrees, 10 seconds, 185 degrees, 5 seconds. Now, those time temperature relationships are based on every drop of wine reaching the indicated temperatures and being held there for the indicated length of time. Now, using a plate type heat exchanger, this assumption is probably true. It is definitely not true of the tubular type, where you have one tube inside another, because in the tubular type there's a tendency for the liquid to stratify as it flows through the tube, and it's very difficult, if almost impossible, for every drop of the liquid to reach the temperature indicated by your thermometers or temperature recorders. And that's why we use quite a safety factor. Instead of 185 degrees for 5 seconds, it's generally 185 degrees for 30 seconds, and some people even want 60 seconds at that temperature, where they're using the tubular type. If they use the plate and frame type, then you can stick to these time temperature relationships, apply a fudge factor to give yourself some leeway of, say, 50%, and you can be sure that you won't have any trouble as far as sterilizing the wine is concerned. Now, which is the best relationship to use? Low temperature, long time, or high temperature, short time? Well, predicated on the findings in the food industry, they have found that without exception, I think I'm safe in saying this, that the high temperature short time heating does the least damage to quality. So where you have an option, choose the high temperature short time relationship rather than the reverse. Now, pasteurizing just prior to bottling, and by pasteurizing I mean bringing the wine up to temperature, holding it for a specified period of time, and then bring it back down again to ambient temperature or room temperature, or slightly above that temperature, probably does the least damage to quality than any other method of heating. But there's one drawback, and this is a major one. You are bulk pasteurizing the wine, and the wine must flow from your pasteurizer through hoses or pipes into the filling machine and then into the bottle, and there's always a chance of recontamination. So even though it does less damage than hot bottling, you always have that uncertainty as whether you're going to recontaminate your wine or not after it has been pasteurized. So hot bottling is considered to be preferable from the standpoint of assurance of achieving sterility over bulk pasteurization. Because if you bottle hot and provide you use a sterile closure, you have a guaranteed method of achieving sterility in the wine. Now, to do this, it's necessary for the wine to be introduced into the bottle at not less than 120 degrees Fahrenheit. This, coupled with the long time required for the wine to cool down again to ambient temperature, will sterilize the wine. It'll kill the microbiological population that may be present. Because the wines are cased and palletized, therefore they're very slow to return to room temperature. And during this long cooling off period, the sterilization is achieved. Sterile filtration is another method. And that, of course, impairs the quality the least of the three methods we discussed so far, provided that you take pains that you do not unduly aerate the wine during the sterile filtration. But sterile filtration requires very painstaking attention to all the details. Before the advent of membrane filtration, which is another method of achieving sterility, we use so-called sterile pads, mixtures of asbestos and cellulose, sometimes even straight asbestos pads, and required a great attention to detail to get the wine into the bottle in a sterile or near sterile condition. Those wineries that were successful in using this usually required about an hour and a half prior to this time that bottling started to get everything set up and operating properly. And then probably another hour, hour and a half at the close of the bottling day to clean up the equipment. But if all attention was paid to the details and a very rigorous procedure developed, it could be used with satisfaction and pretty good assurance that the wine would reach the bottle, perhaps not sterile, but with a population of yeast or bacteria so low that it would not pose any problem when it went to the market. But it did require that you bottle only sound, well-balanced wines that have been properly made and finished. If you're trying to handle unsound wines, wines say that had gone through a stuck fermentation, had been infected with bacteria, or that were unbalanced, then it was very, very difficult to get a sterile product in the bottle. Membrane filtration is probably, yes, it is the newest procedure, physical procedure that's been developed to achieve sterility. It's been in use now in the wine industry for somewhere between 10 and 15 years. And it uses membranes. In the case of the millipore and the Gelman membranes, they're cellulose acetate or cellulose nitrate. And they are so made that the maximum opening in the membrane will be at a specified size. For example, 0.80, 0.65 are micron micron membranes are commonly used in the wine industry, and even some cases 0.55. And if the membrane is stamped 0.80, that means that the largest opening in the membrane is 0.80, and any particle that is larger than 0.80 will not pass through the membrane, provided that there's no rupture of the membrane. And they develop tests for determine whether or not the membrane is sound at any point during the filtration. The millipore membrane, the Gelman membrane, are actually in-depth filters, even though it's a very, very thin membrane. The pore sizes are not uniform. And the membrane, if you look at a microphotograph of the membrane, that is electron microphotograph of the membrane, you would see various size openings, and look at it from the side, be something like that. Of course, that's a very great exaggeration of the thickness of the membrane, because the membrane is really quite thin. The other membrane, and this is a newer development than the millipore or the Gelman, is the nucleopore. That is developed by General Electric, and they use the polycarbonate film, which they bombard with atomic particles, and wherever the particle strikes, it weakens the membrane. Then they, after the membrane has been bombarded, it's etched. And in the etching process, they will etch out all the bombarded spots, and by the combination of the bombardment and the etching, they will develop a true sieve membrane, very thin and with absolutely uniform holes. So if they say a 0.80, that means that all of the holes are 0.80. This has one advantage in that, being a surface or a true screen type of filter, it's much easier to backwash and to reactivate the filter by removing the material which is plugging it or covering up the holes. Well, these, yes?
What's the standard price for those?
Standard what?
Price.
Price? I haven't the slightest idea.
Do they make them commercially yet? I mean, is something on the market now?
They're both the millipore, the Gelman, and the nucleopore are all available. Again, like pasteurization, you always have the problem of reinfection after the filtration. And that's one of the big problems in using sterile filtration, either employing an asbestos pad or employing the membranes, is to avoid contamination after the wines have been filtered. Therefore, it's recommended that the filtrate go directly to the filler rather than going into a surge bottling tank in between the filter and the filling machine. And the ideal, of course, would be to have the filter right next to the filling machine to reduce the chance of contamination with long pipelines or hoses. There's still another method of achieving sterility, and that's to kill the yeast or the bacteria chemically. We used to have a choice mainly between sorbic acid and DEPC, diethyl pyrocarbonate. Sorbic acid was the first one that appeared on the scene and was used to quite a large extent. Requires about usually 100 to 200 parts per million to be effective. It does not kill the yeast, and at those concentrations it merely inhibits the yeast. But it's long-lasting as long as it's present. If it's there in sufficient quantity to inhibit the yeast, it'll be very effective in preventing the growth of yeast in the wine. Sorbic acid is would have been used for a number of years. It has the drawback that the longer it remains in the wine, the more off odor develops, which has been ascribed to geraniol. Whether it is geraniol or not, many people think it smells like that. And the longer it remains in the wine, the more this odor appears. And of course, that's a foreign odor to wine, and is definitely undesirable. For that reason, the industry was looking for better methods. And DEPC, diethyl pyocarbonate, came along. This is again 10, 12 years ago, something like that, maybe even longer. And it was ideal because it broke down in the wine to carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol. So it looked like the ideal arrangement. It would sterilize the wine. It would actually kill the yeast. And over a period of a few hours, it broke down to primarily ethyl alcohol and carbon dioxide. And since you only required to use from 50 to about 150 parts per million, the amount of carbon dioxide and ethyl alcohol that is produced was so minor as not to be even analyzable by the techniques that we have available to us. It also, about 5%, breaks down to DEC, diethyl carbonate. And the diethyl carbonate remains in the wine, and that is, it's easy to analyze for, and that's one of the methods we have of determining whether or not DEPC is added to wine. We use this widely. It practically completely supplanted the use of sorbic acid. It was the ideal sterilizing agent until about a year ago. The FDA banned it because he said it, under certain circumstances in wine, it formed urethane. And urethane is a known carcinogen. So that was the end of DEPC. The particular urethane that's supposedly formed in wine is ethyl carbamate. And whether it's formed in sufficient quantity in wine to even begin to pose a carcinogenic threat is something that's been worked on ever since. Maybe someday we'll have the answer to it. Because it's by far the best sterilized agent that's ever been afforded to the wine industry or a number of other industries for that matter. Well, now I want to go on to fillers. There are formerly three main types of fillers. Recently another type has been added to it. The former three main types of fillers were siphon, vacuum, and gravity. And recently, I say recently, within the last several years, the pressure fillers have become more widely used, especially with the advent of slightly carbonated wines, those not having over 7 pounds carbonation per, or just 7 pounds carbonation, I should say. And these all have top-filling spouts, with a few exceptions. And tests that have been made on them show very little variation in the amount of oxygen introduced into the wine as a result of the filling action among these three different types of fillers. A number of years ago, bottom filling spouts were developed. You know, the ordinary filler, the fills practically from the top. They develop spouts that fill actually from the bottom. And tests showed that if you use a bottom filling spout, that you reduce the amount of oxygen introduced into the wine by up to as much as 0.5 of a cc per liter, which was appreciable. One exception to no difference or very little difference noted in the oxygen pickup among these different types of fillers is that with a vacuum filler, if very high vacuums are used, then the oxygen pickup is usually increased a bit. Next is the bottle. Some of the factors you want to consider in selecting the bottle are whether or not the wine is to be binned, the headspace, and the color of the glass. If you're going to bin wines for a period of time, it's almost essential that you use a cork rather than a screw cap closure, because the wine generally matures better in a cork bottle than in a screw cap bottle. So if you're going to bin your wine for any period of time, the first choice for a closure is a cork. We've done some test work here, and we find that with the average screw cap that we have provided the wine with protection for about 2 years. And that's only with the self-forming threads. Though reportedly, and we have not tested this, a pilfer-proof cap does give better protection than just the straight self-thread forming cap. The headspace is very important because 1/5 of the headspace, that's filled with air of course, is oxygen. So if you have a 20 cc headspace, you've got 4 cc's of oxygen available to the wine. So that would be the absolute maximum headspace that you'd want. And nowadays, with cork closed table wine bottles, most of them are so designed that when the cork is inserted, the wine and the cork meet. So there's practically no headspace there. And the color of the glass, since bottled wines they get eventually exposed to light, the color of the glass is going to have a distinct bearing on the stability of the wine. If you look at this mimeograph, you'll see that there is an effect of glass. White glass and green glass offer practically no protection. And brown glass offers a great deal of protection, with red glass being the perfect color as far as maximum protection to the wine from light is concerned. Now, in this chart here, those clouds which were formed were probably due to the effect of ultraviolet light on protein denaturation, because you remember in the discussion on protein, UV was shown to be very effective in denaturing protein, breaking the bonds next to the several of the amino acids, particularly the benzene ring amino acids. Wines are going to be binned for a reasonable length of time. Should be closed with a straight, untapered wine cork. In other words, we don't want a wine cork that's tapered like this. We want a straight wine cork, at least 1.5 inches long. And if it's going to be been for a long period of time, 1 3/4 inch long cork is recommended. If you're going to insert these wines with a hand corker, then they only need to be chamfered on one end. And chamfered means rounding off the edges on each end so that when the cork is inserted, the edge won't break off. In other words, it's rounded like this. So if you're going to insert by hand, you only need to chamfer one end, you only need to clean one end. Now, if you look at a cork, you'll notice that the end usually has a groove in it, or maybe 3, 4, 5 grooves. That's where pockets of cork dust have been cut out by using a sharp knife, because if these are not cut out, they'll be picked up by the wine and contribute to the cloudiness of the wine. If you're going to use automatic corkers, then you must use corks that have been chamfered and cleaned on both ends, and that's the way most of them come nowadays, because most of the corks that are used are inserted with automatic corkers. And with a screw cap closure, the one in which the threads are formed as the cap is forced onto the bottle head is to be preferred. In other words, the self-forming threads. You can buy caps with threads already inside the cap, or you can buy blank caps if you have the machine that will form the threads on the cap as the cap is forced onto the neck of the bottle. And of course that is to be preferred because this way the threads in the cap and the threads on the bottleneck absolutely fit, because one has formed the other. Before bottling, necessary to determine if the wine is stable. That's self-evident, but sometimes it is forgotten or overlooked or not given the importance it should have. Should determine the amounts of copper and iron, test for heat and cold stability, and in addition, it's highly desirable that the wine be tested for the presence of protective colloids by the method I gave you in the previous lecture. Because they could be removed by the close filtration at the time of bottling and then cause the wine to cloud later on in the bottle. Add from 10 to 25 parts per million of SO2 to red wines, depend upon the pH and the stability of the wine, and from 20 to 50 parts per million of whites, again to depend upon the pH and other factors. It's quite common practice in bottling whites to use inline stripping. That's where the sparging device, well, I guess I might as well get it inside the thing here, is inserted in the hose line or pipeline, and nitrogen is introduced, and then the nitrogen diffuses out into the wine through very small openings in a plate, and as the wine goes into the filling machine and rises in the bowl, the nitrogen will escape from the wine and carry out a good part of the oxygen. So inline nitrogen sparging in bottling table wines, white table wines, is quite commonly practiced. And the preparation of the bottling equipment is most important. It should not only be clean, but it also must be sterile. So here's one of the procedures that can be used to clean and sterilize your bottling line, bottling equipment prior to starting bottling. You can make up a solution of 250 to 500 parts per million of chlorine with sodium hypochlorite and heat to 140 degrees Fahrenheit, or you can use just hot water without the chlorine added and heat the hot water to 170 degrees Fahrenheit. Circulate this for 5 to 10 minutes through the whole bottling setup. There's the hoses, the fillers, the pumps, the bottling tank, and the filling machine. If you're going to use hot water alone, you must get all surfaces up to 160 degrees Fahrenheit, and it must be maintained there for at least 30 seconds. Place bottles on the filler, fill the bottles with this cleaning solution, and leave in place. And hold the solution in the filler for 20 minutes. And wash thoroughly with warm water. Then finally with tap water. And then start the wine through the system and discard the first bottle from each spout. Well, there are many variations on that, but that is one of the procedures that can be used, and it's sound. If it's properly used, it'll ensure that you have a sterile bottling setup, provided you don't have air pockets in any place in your equipment that prevent the cleaning solution or the hot water from reaching these pockets. If you're using corks, you have a problem of cork dust and also cork extractives. That's why the ends of the corks are usually cut with a knife to remove any pockets of cork dust that are present, because they will go into the wine after the cork is inserted and will contribute to the unsightliness of the wine. And cork extractives must be removed. If you're using non-paraffin corks, then when the cork is compressed, some liquid will be squeezed out, and this liquid will contain cork extractives, which again will cause unsightly or produce unsightly materials in the wine. And the corks, before they're to be used, if they're non-paraffin corks, must be softened and sterilized. And this can be accomplished by soaking for about an hour in a cold 250 parts per million solution of sulfur dioxide. And if you want to, you can put a little glycerin in to make the corks slip into the bottle easier. Following soaking, the cork should be well rinsed with clear water and then thoroughly drained before use. In fact, a number of the wineries have used the drying element in washers to remove the excess liquid from their corks after the soaking and rinsing period. In fact, they'll use that also for the rinsing. Because you want to get rid of as much of that moisture as possible to minimize the possibility of introducing cork extractives into the bottled wine. Paraffin corks at one time were not used to a very large extent, but now they are. It's very, very common to see wineries using paraffin corks. And of course, if you have paraffin corks, you don't have to worry about treating them prior to use. They're just used as they come from the supplier. One thing about paraffin corks, if you're going to hot bottle, don't use them. I had an experience one time. I was at a winery that was primarily a producer of table wines and mainly whites. And we used paraffin corks and we hot bottled. And we got complaints from time to time. One time I opened by mail. There was a package there, opened the thing up, and it had the neck of a bottle with the cork in place in the neck. And a letter coming in, the man said, I'm very, very fond of your Chateau Sauterne. He said, I drink it several times a week. He said, I have bought every corkscrew on the market. And he said, invariably I fail to extract the cork. He said, I finally found the ideal way. I just take a hammer and knock the neck off. So I think it illustrates pretty well the dangers of hot balling when you're using paraffin corks. In balling, it's a good practice to take samples from the first and eighth case and check them immediately for clarity and fill point. Now, you can set up the best procedure in the world for preparing your balling equipment and for following the balling operation, and people are only human. Sometimes they'll slip. So just as insurance, take a sample from the first and the eighth case and check it immediately for clarity, and also check it for fill point, because the fill point can vary. And you're only allowed a certain variation in the fill point, or you're going to get into trouble with the federal government. And you should also take a sample from the 25th case. And you should give one of these the heat and cold stability test and an incubation test for viable yeast. Just because it's possible for something to happen to disturb the stability of the wine if there's been some mistakes made in preparing the equipment, or even the mistake made of hooking onto the wrong tank for bottling, which has been known to happen also. One of the best Pinot Noirs I have ever drunk that's produced in California was as a result of a horrible mistake. It had to be a martini. He told his bottling man to hook onto tank so-and-so and bottle this wine in magnums. And he hooked onto a tank of Pinot Noir that had absolutely nothing done to it. No clarification, no nothing, no filtration or anything. Put it in these magnums. It turned out to be a magnificent wine. Of course, you had to decant it before you drank it. Unfortunately, there was only a couple hundred cases, and it went to all his friends, never got on the market. Well, those are some of the things that can happen. In corking, it's desirable to use a machine that's designed and timed so that there's a instant's pause after the cork is compressed by the jaws, and a jet of air will blow this teardrop of liquid off the bottom of the cork. Because when the jaws compress the cork, it's going to squeeze out more or less liquid, depending upon the amount of liquid that remains in the cork. And this liquid invariably contains material that when it goes into the wine, it looks like you've dropped 1 or 2 drops of milk into the wine. We call it cork milk or cork juice. And it's a very simple thing to design the corker to have that momentary pause after the compression of the jaws and a blast of air across the bottom to get rid of that squeezed out drop or 2 drops of cork juice. And it's good practice to periodically pull a cork. If you're corking all day, every hour or two, just grab a bottle and pull the cork and check it to be sure that the cork is not being creased by the jaws. Because if the jaws get out of adjustment, they'll put a permanent crease into the side of the cork, and of course, then you're going to have a leaky bottle. And if you're using screw caps, it's a good idea to check them periodically for the degree of tightness. They have gauges made for that purpose, whereby you can check the amount of pounds of pull required to unscrew the cap. Now, in corking, the air in the headspace is compressed because you're driving that cork in. The cork is much larger than the neck of the bottle. It's compressed and driven in, and as it's driven in, the air in the headspace is compressed. If you take these newly corked bottles and place the bottle on its side or upside down, as a large number of wineries pack their wines now, this compressed air will be entirely absorbed by the wine because it has no place to go. And if the cork has the slightest tendency to leak, this compressed air in there will increase that tendency, and you'll have a messy bottle because of wine that will leak out around the cork. So if you're going to practice bottling and compressing that air, the thing to do is to stand your bottles upright for 24 hours after bottling to allow the air, compressed air, to leak out around the cork or to be absorbed, which is what usually happens, to be absorbed and the pressure reduced to normal before you pack the wine on the side or pack it upside down. Of course, the best method is to use a corker that's equipped with a device to pull a vacuum on the headspace above the wine just prior to insertion of the cork. They're so designed that they'll pull a vacuum and maintain that vacuum while the cork is inserted. Therefore, you do not compress the air in there, only to a very slight extent, because you pull most of the air out by this vacuum prior to the insertion of the cork. Just some general observations: avoid metal pickup, practice cleanliness, minimize aeration, and above all, don't forget that your pre-bottling stability tests are worthless if you change the condition of the wine after the tests are made. Any questions on bottling? Okay. Yes.
If use of red bottles or red glass in bottles is better for the wine, and the reason it's not is just tradition.
Usually red glass is associated with the drugstore. Medicinal preparations. So that's a association I don't think the wine industry wants to encourage. That wine may be a medicinal preparation.
Instead of having vacuum filters or vacuum, saying the plug into the bottle, do they have ones where they insert nitrogen gas?
Yes.
Then plug it?
A number of the wineries will sparge their bottles, usually with carbon dioxide. Sometimes nitrogen, usually carbon dioxide. It takes about 3 volumes of carbon dioxide to do a good job of removing the air. And then the bottle is moved over to the filling machine and filled. But it's still a good idea to apply a vacuum there because you'll avoid the possibility of getting leakers.
What sort of treatment should be done to the bottles as they arrive from the glass maker?
If you're taking the bottles almost directly from the glass factory, just storing them for a few days or a week, and provided you use normal precautions, you need to do nothing except to remove the loose case fibers, in other words, below them. No, I'm not going to say any more about that. There's very little danger of yeast or bacteria infection from not sterilizing new glass. Very little danger. We got a few minutes yet. One of the things that when I was talking about color, I don't think I emphasized sufficiently. I think you'll recall I made the statement that polymerization of pigment had a decided effect upon its behavior, and that acetaldehyde was a very good agent for polymerizing because it would form the connecting link between 2 molecules of pigment, or a molecule of pigment and a non-pigment phenolic. So what in your opinion would be the short-term effect upon the color? Because remember I said that when these pigments are, you might say, immobilized in the polymers, they no longer respond to pH change. So what do you think would be the effect of, short-term effect of forming these polymers with acetaldehyde? Remember, they're no longer responsive to pH change. They're in a colored form. And at usual wine pH, only about, at the most, a third of the pigments in the colored form. So here, whatever you have in the polymer would be all colored. That's right. Now, what would be the long-term effect? These polymers can continue building. That's right. Short-term effect is generally an increase in color, long-term effect is generally a decrease in color. That's one thing I did not emphasize enough in the lecture. Still have about 2 minutes. You have any questions you want to bring up? Anything on the course? Anything that's still puzzling you? Anything that you want refreshed on that might be asked in the final? I'll quit 1 minute ahead of time. Give you a break.